Hello and welcome to Compass, a production from Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass. This is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, we will look at the debate over the only private prison in Minnesota. We will look at how both sides argued their case at a local and legislative level. First, we have a closer look at Appleton, Minnesota's efforts to reopen the local prison, especially the efforts of citizens in that community. Here is Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser with more.
The Appleton Prison has been a serious issue for its community since its close in 2010. In late February, nearly 300 community members attended a local meeting in support of efforts to reopen the prison. A month later, Representatives Tim Miller and Lyle Coonan introduced a bill to the House of Public Safety and Crime Prevention Committee that would force the state of Minnesota to use the Appleton Prison.
It is not an overstatement to say that we are currently in a crisis. It is beholden upon us to do something about it now, this session. That's why I've proposed House File 3223, a bill that directs the Commissioner to enter into a lease agreement to operate the vacant 1,600-bed prison facility in Appleton and run it just like any other state facility with good-paying union jobs. I recognize that there has been some concern about the company that owns this facility, which is precisely why we have drafted the bill in this way. The company would have no involvement in the daily operations, staffing, or inmate care at the facility. It would be entirely run and operated by the DOC, just like any other prison facility in the state. The Appleton Prison would also bring hundreds of jobs to a region of our state that still continues to struggle economically.
When the prison was operational, 80 of the 350 employees actually lived in Appleton and bought and supported the community. The region has struggled to rebound economically for the last 5 years with the farm prices and everything. Some people who have worked in the Appleton Prison in the past and surrounding communities have left the area because of no jobs.
So when we talk about the impact of 350 jobs, and this is what the Appleton facility employed less than 10 years ago, it's not that big of an impact to the state. It's 0.01%. When we look at the region, it's 1%. And when we look at Swift County, it's 7%. It's huge. It's a big impact, and that's why we're here.
Those in opposition of the prison were given a chance to speak after the meeting reconvened due to the protester disruptions.
Today we've heard a long economic argument for the area around Swift County and what that means to the people there. And I know that Representative Schoen mentioned it earlier. There are lots of areas of our state that are currently struggling. And the question is, are we looking at all of those areas of the state that are struggling and willing to invest $140 million, a commitment of $140 million over 6 to 10 years to actually fund that? And I don't think we are.
We've been pitched this private prison as a means of economic development rather than what it is, a corporate handout. If anything else were the case, why has not a single economic development project for Appleton and Swift County been brought before the legislature? Why not invest in projects that serve community needs?
I don't have all the answers. I'm not armed with alternatives, but I do possess some truth. I spent time incarcerated in 5 different Minnesota prisons. 4 of them state prisons, 1 of them Appleton Prairie Correctional Facility, owned by the CCA. And when you're in a place like a CCA-owned prison, it's the hardest thing to do, to find comfort, because it's deplorable conditions. So when we're being shipped into Appleton Prison on a bus, when these farms, and some of these farms are closing down and being sold, when they see that bus driving into Appleton, that should not give the community hope when they see that bus drive by.
This is a question that I think we all need to answer for ourselves, and that is, do we think it's okay to build an economy that's on the back of inmates?
The bill was approved by the House Public Safety and Crime Prevention Committee and referred to House Ways and Means Committee.
Okay, the vote being 10 aye and 7 nay, the bill is referred. Meeting adjourned.
With us now to talk about the prison issue, we have Mike Pogge-Weaver, the Swift County Administrator, and Swift County has been active in bringing the prison proposal to life. And from the other side of the issue, we have Dan McGrath, and he is with the organization TakeAction Minnesota. Dan, Mike, thanks for joining us on Compass.
Thank you, Les.
You know, Mike, during the break there, when we watched that package, I should probably make a correction that there's actually more than one private prison in Minnesota. I talked about Appleton being the only one, but you'd made the point there's actually, I think, three private incarceration systems, right?
That's what I understand, yes.
Yeah, so I should get that correction out of the way first. This issue is really complicated, and it has been such a contentious issue because, of course, there's been a lot of discussions in newspapers. There was the disruption of the hearing. But I ran across a quote the other day that I thought put it pretty well. This is from Reed Anfinson of the Swift County Monitor News that says that there are three basic solutions under discussion for the prison issue. There's sentencing reform, there is creating more prison beds, or a combination of the two. And that's really what a lot of this boils down to. So, Mike, let's back up a little bit and start with you. When Swift County got involved with this issue, wasn't it in large part because you heard about the proposal for Rush City, which is an expansion proposal in Minnesota, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we had heard that Rush City was proposing to build, or the Department of Corrections was proposing to build 500 new beds in Rush City. And certainly we asked our question as a community, when we see a vacant prison, why would the state want to make that type of investment when the beds were here? And knowing that the current owners had made proposals to actually lease it to the state of Minnesota and let the state of Minnesota operate the facility, knowing the current administration, knowing what the Department of Corrections wanted, it made a lot of sense to advance a proposal that would have the state of Minnesota operate and run a facility here in Appleton versus building those new permanent beds in another community.
And we should add for clarification that for viewers who aren't familiar with the viewing area, Appleton is within Swift County, so Appleton is one of the communities that you work on serving.
That's correct. Yep.
Swift County. Dan, from your perspective as a leader of a statewide organization, TakeAction Minnesota, how has this prison become sort of a lightning rod for the statewide discussion of public versus private? How has that really happened?
Yeah, when you take a step back and just look at the issues around incarceration and criminal justice in Minnesota, we're a state that's seeing a rapidly increasing prison population, and it's true, we have an overcrowding problem right now. A lot of folks in county facilities as opposed to state jails, or state prisons rather. And the question in front of us is, are we going to try to keep expanding the number of people that we're locking up, or are we going to look at other methods to both rehabilitate people and ideally scale down the number of people that are incarcerated? And so, corporations like the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, the private operator of, or the private owner of the prison, stand to, they seek to take advantage of that dynamic. I think as a state, we want to be asking the question of, well, hold on here. Do we want more people locked up, or should we be looking at other methods to curb the prison population?
And I know, Mike, from your perspective, it's not just a question of, necessarily, how many people are incarcerated or how many people aren't, but it's also, from the public meeting that I attended where you spoke, it's an issue of where they're incarcerated. Because isn't Minnesota rather unusual in the positioning of its prisons around the state and where people are incarcerated?
Absolutely. We actually mapped all prisons in in the United States, state by state, to understand where prisons are located. Minnesota is unique. It's the only state in the United States where all their prisons are located in a very short distance around the metro. That creates huge barriers for families outside the metro to actually visit loved ones. Because remember, incarcerating individuals in the state occur throughout the state. It's not just a metro area. We understand there may be more population, but they're not all from the metro. But I think one of the dynamics we really want to stress, though, we don't see this as a private-public discussion at all. I mean, this may be a privately owned facility, but certainly the proposal is for it to be publicly ran.
And of course, for clarity's sake, when this issue has come up in the past, a lot of the discussion has been focused on whether Minnesota inmates would simply be housed there, as they were in some cases prior to 2010, or whether the prison would be leased by the state and then state employees operating in it. That's the proposal that we've seen most recently, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And we should say that as of the time that we're having this discussion now, in late April, what we've seen is that the House has it in one of the budget bills, correct?
It's in an omnibus bill, and actually there's now been a bill introduced into the Senate that would also have and direct the Commissioner of Corrections to begin an attempt to negotiate for either a purchase or a lease to own of the facility, and then report back to the legislative session the next year. Yeah.
And Dan, what about this issue of Minnesota being unusual in terms of where the prisons are? Because isn't the relationship between a family member who's incarcerated and maintaining contact with their family members and those regular visits. That's an important part of recovery and also reducing recidivism rates, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's absolutely true that having access to your family and your loved ones makes a big difference in terms of someone being able to take a positive step from being incarcerated to the world outside. And I would definitely take at your word that I think if Minnesota doesn't geographically distribute its prisons the way other states might, that's important. But the larger question, I think, underneath that is, are prisons an effective driver of economic development? And, what we'd say is the reopening of the opening of any prison is at best a temporary solution and doesn't drive the sort of economic development that we actually, want and need to see in the greater part of the state or any part of the state. And so we have to be looking for solutions that are actually driving the kind of economic development we want and need. And we'd rather see a focus on those sorts of issues that both create jobs but also improve the quality of jobs that are available to people.
So, Mike, from a Swift County perspective, this is an issue of economic development. Quantify that. I mean, how many jobs are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, it's certainly an economic development issue. And if you see the coalition that has supported the Appleton option, we have over 50 organizations, a number of counties, cities, religious, faith-based organizations, mental health, hospitals have come together really to promote this as an option. We are really proud of the fact of the service that this community provided when the facility was open, with the faith-based community going in and providing services. They had over 1,000 individuals that did a lot of volunteering. From an economic development standpoint, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's not a great thing, because 350 jobs when it was open at the max is fantastic. Not all those jobs were located within Swift County. In Appleton, we had about 80 individuals that lived in the community that worked at the prison. Regionally, I mean, we had people from Ortonville to Granite Falls that worked at the prison. And so this is a huge, not just for Swift County, but regionally is a huge economic development driver. Swift County has an average wage of about $14 an hour. It's lower than the state average. The entry-level correctional officer receives about $17.50 an hour. To have entry-level jobs be higher than your regional average salary is huge for a community, and so we see great benefits from this. But I think to just say that this is an economic development project, where it is, but certainly with this asset that's sitting in the community, it just really begs when you have 600 inmates sitting in county jails, not getting the services, not getting job training, not getting mental health services, not getting drug services. I mean, the Star Trib did a fantastic article talking about kind of these lost souls that are sitting in county jails. We can certainly have an argument about public versus private, but frankly, getting them into an institution where they can get these services to lower recidivism is going to be better for outcomes for these individuals. What we have now is just simply broken.
So, in Minnesota right now, about 40% of the prison population is made up of people who have violated parole or probation in some way, right? And so when you think about it, we have almost 10,000 people incarcerated in our state. It's about 4,000 people. That's a big driver of what, we're calling an overcrowding problem. Again, when you take a step back and you think about, well, what is the trajectory our state is on, right? Right now, Minnesota has the second highest growing rate of incarceration of any state in the country, right? Second only behind Maine, actually. So we're increasingly incarcerating more and more people. And we got to wrestle with the question of, is that actually an economic development strategy for our state? It is important that we're creating quality jobs, and that's nothing to sneeze at, that people have the ability to make ends meet. But when you think about the path we're on, the question we should be asking is there a better way to get people the sort of help they need, to get the addiction care, to get the mental health care, and is the best place for that prison? Should we be locking up those people in the first place? Or if they've done their time and then they're on probation and parole and they violate it in some way, yes, they should be held accountable. Safety is foundational to this entire conversation. People need to be safe. But are we made more safe when someone who's addicted goes to prison and then comes out? Should they be getting and can they be getting services in a better situation?
And let's clarify here, when we talk about the county inmates, or the inmates who are state inmates, right now they're housed at county prisons around the state.
County jails.
Yeah, county jails, excuse me. and 500 or so, approximately, in county jails around the state?
Yep.
And then, so what happens is the state contracts with those counties, and then those counties receive a certain amount for that. So in some cases, in some counties, the counties are receiving a significant amount of funds right now for jails that might otherwise not necessarily have as high a prisoner count, right?
Absolutely. But I think you also think about what is a jail versus what is a prison. You know, a jail is really set up for inmates to go and serve time of less than a year. And so when you are going to a jail, you know, sometimes you're there a few days. Our average stay in Swift County is 9 days. So you don't build treatment programs, you don't build educational opportunities. They're not housed to provide long-term care to these inmates. And that's unfortunately what the state has now turned to, where they have ran out of prison space, so they need to turn and have that reliever. You know, DOC is now looking at, by 2023, to actually have 1,300 inmates over their current capacity.
And that's based on the progression of population at the current rate, right?
That's based on current rate, based on current sentencing. Even with some of the sentencing guidelines that have come down, they're still going to be way over capacity. I think the question, you know, there absolutely has to be a discussion about sentencing reform. How do we address that? There needs to be a question on what's the right punishment for drug crimes. Are we giving the right punishment out? You know, I had a conversation with the county attorney and county sheriff recently, and I asked, you know, think of your last 5 people we've sent to prison on drug charges. Were any of these first-time offenders that we've had? And the answer was no. These were, you know, number of drug charges, big purchases. These weren't, you know, low time. Now think of the 5 first-time, you know, drug charges we've had. You know, what kind of sentencing? These are 30-day sentencing. Usually it comes with a suspended sentence. So, you know, they're not even going to have it on their record if they serve their time, serve their probation. You know, we're looking for drug court rehabilitation avenues. You know, we're trying to move people to a different path. Unfortunately, once you get to the point that you're going to prison, I mean, you're talking about individuals that have been in and out of the system, that frankly, traditional mental health, traditional drug rehabilitation hasn't worked. And you have to look for a reset of how do you address these chronic individuals that keep coming in and out of prison.
As we look at some of these issues, there are 2 groups, I think, that were also looking at some of these issues from a state level, and people may have heard about them. There was a task force, correct, looking at prison populations and how do we address it. And also then there's sentencing reform, sentencing guideline commissions. So I know, Dan, you've looked at both of those. So, and you mentioned sentencing reform. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so sentencing guidelines is the guidance given to judges and prosecutors when sentencing someone for a crime. So they've been charged, they've been found guilty, and now the question is how much time are they going to serve as their penalty. And this is a debate also happening nationally, right? The question is then, what are the sorts of standards for people should be serving for a drug crime, for a minimal amount of possession of a drug versus the desire to sell that drug, right? What's driving the explosion in prison population in Minnesota is the prosecution and the incarceration of people for low-level drug crimes. And you know, what I would push back on a bit is that I don't think people are getting the sort of care that they do need to handle addiction well. If they were, we wouldn't be seeing this problem. But we also have a criminal justice system that has now been built around incarcerating people for drug crimes. So, you know, the question to be asking, right, is if that's our problem, if the problem is a culture that's becoming more and more addicted to drugs, what can we do to stop that? And is prison the right remedy? Now, without a doubt, there are people who should be incarcerated if they are, you know, moving large amounts of drugs into our communities and harming people or harming other people. But that's different from a low-level drug crime, which you see more and more and more people incarcerated for.
And one of the reform proposals has been to change, particularly in the low-level drug crimes, and that changes it. Mike, I know you also went to prison task force meetings where there were legislators, and they weren't necessarily required to come up with a specific recommendation, but they had some ideas that came out before the beginning of the legislative session to say, what do we do about the prison population? What was your reaction to their work?
I think it's clearly a divisive issue. You know, when you have individuals that face battery and, you know, really push back to saying, you know, releasing someone early or releasing someone that hasn't had the right treatment, you know, can bring them back into a community and begin that cycle. I mean, they're clearly concerned about it. There's certainly, one of the things that I took away that I've told a lot of people, dealing with issues of racial disparity, certainly we've had clear racial disparity issues in our sentencing. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and crack cocaine carried a larger crime, and it impacted minorities. We need to address those issues, and certainly need to look for areas where there's that disparity. There's no question about that. And I think there's a lot of desire on both sides to really think through those issues and address those. But I don't think there's one magic bullet. Where we had a discussion that, Minnesota is the second fastest growing population in prison growth. We're also the fourth lowest incarceration state in the United States. So it doesn't take very many numbers to make you look like a fast growing community on a percentage-wise.
And to clarify what that means is that those studies are often, as I recall, the percentage of persons incarcerated as a percentage of population, so number of individuals per 10,000 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That's a fairly common number. And I know Maine, which you'd mentioned earlier, was often very low on the list, and Minnesota was also in that same grouping. So as compared to other states, we incarcerate a relatively small number of individuals. But as you said, that the trajectory of that is that it's increasing, correct?
That's right. And I think this is also what's driving bipartisan interest in trying to tamp down the growth of the criminal justice system and to address this larger issue of really mass incarceration. As a country, right, we incarcerate more people than any other country, developed country in the world. What's driving this larger debate is that it is, from the conservative side of things, just getting more and more expensive to pay for an ever-expanding criminal justice system. And that's diverting a lot of state resources that could be going both to the care of people who need it, again, addiction, counseling, mental health care, but also to the kind of economic development we should be investing in. Right? There are bills on the table now that are stuck in the legislature. That could be investing in the transportation infrastructure in the state, something that would benefit every corner of the state to just start fixing roads and bridges and building out the infrastructure we need. To things like guaranteeing that any worker in our state is earning a minimal amount of paid sick leave to care for themselves or a family member. We got 1 million people in the state who work for a living who have no paid time off and have to choose between a job or caring for themselves. Those are small things, but when you add them up, they're what are in the way of people making ends meet and are slowing down the sort of economic growth and sustainability we need to be creating.
Mike, one of the things that I know we've heard about this proposal is that there's also the possibility, Governor Dayton has said, open to the idea, it appears, of purchasing this facility and then making it a state-owned prison. What are the implications of that for a community like Appleton or for the county?
Well, for the city of Appleton, it has some real implications. One of the things is right now CCA is the largest taxpayer in the city of Appleton. It actually represents 40% of their levy. A community that has the 28th highest tax levy in the state out of 850 so cities. Taking that off is a huge burden. It actually moves them from 28th to about the 4th highest in the state. And when you consider there is no other community over 1,000 that has a tax burden like Appleton, I mean, it has real implications. And so, I think we are very much open to the option of a purchase, but there has to be some consideration of how does the city of Appleton work through that, because if you want to kill a community, that would be about the quickest way you could do it.
And one of the options, I suppose, could be a multi-year phase-in, so that because the state-owned property doesn't pay property taxes, so it would be a multi-year phase-in of some sort of local government aid to offset, right?
Yep, and those are some of the discussions we've had with both senators and representatives about it, and leadership about it, because certainly we've been diving into trying to figure out how we can fare. And there's some great examples where the state has done similar programs like that, so Appleton wouldn't be unique from that perspective.
Yeah. Dan, your perspective on a purchase?
Whether or not the question is, are we opening a facility or not, right? And, what we said earlier, is right. We're talking about 500 or so people in the state that currently can't fit into state facilities, into state prisons. We'd rather be having a conversation about whether or not those 500 or some of the other 4,000 that are cycling back into prison because of parole and probation violations, should they be there in the first place, or is there a better way to get them what they need and make our communities safer as a result? So again, what are we doing in terms of electronic monitoring, right? Someone could be at home and working, still be monitored and still be accountable for their actions, but could actually be building a set of job skills and starting to contribute, right? Rather than just being put into a facility and then, both generating a greater expense, but also not necessarily developing and being supported in the way they need to. I don't really think a state purchase of the facility in Appleton solves the larger problem that we're wrestling with. And I think at best it would be another temporary solution. It sounds like not even a particularly good temporary solution based on the realities of the city of Appleton.
Well, go ahead.
And one of the comments I was going to say is I think one of the things that also has to be taken into consideration, we talked a lot about state budget resources and how that's important to consider. The DOC has talked about and talked with the bonding committee, Department of Corrections has talked with the bonding committees and has actually noted they're facing a $1 billion deferred maintenance bill. They have 3 of their facilities that are actually over 100 years. 2 of them are 120 years. They brought a steam pipe that they sawed it in half and took it out and poked holes through it, and this is what our facilities are built on. I think there is an option for the state long term to think about purchasing a facility that's 20 years old, has been maintained, actually continues to have annual inspections by the Department of Corrections, is licensed to operate 1,600 beds. They're in it. They make sure that it's up to code. There's actually a staff out there 24/7, 365. They're doing maintenance. They've re-roofed it. They've put HVAC. So it's being maintained. I think it's actually would be a wiser investment for the state of Minnesota to really consider a purchase versus these big dollars that we're looking at long term about these facilities and where they're going today.
Yeah, we've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to get to some closing thoughts here because, of course, the legislative session regular session ends May 23rd. It has moved somewhere in the House, not clear where it's going to the Senate. Any predictions as we look toward the end of the session where we'll end up? I'll start with you, Dan.
I think, right now Governor Dayton has said that he wouldn't sign a bill to just flatly reopen this facility. So I think its prospects in this session are slim, but there's certainly a lot of work and a lot of discussion yet to be had. I think again, the bigger question in front of us is, what is Minnesota's plan to curtail a growth in incarceration and actually make our communities safer? At the same time, we got to be wrestling with a bunch of very sticky questions as they relate to racial equity. And are we investing in both rural communities and in communities of color so that all boats are being lifted, so that our state as a whole is safer and more prosperous?
Mike, any predictions from you?
It's been a very interesting legislative session, 10 weeks, a lot of things, it was going to be short. I'm optimistic, and I think we think that there is a great question before the legislature of just simply having the conversation about what would a purchase price, and that's what's in front of the legislature right now. It's not forcing a sale, and it would have to go back legislatively. We think we're optimistic it'll get done.
Okay, great. Mike Pogge-Weaver, Swift County Administrator, Dan McGrath, TakeAction Minnesota. We're out of time, but thank you for joining us this week on Compass.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's it for this week on Compass. If you'd like to know more about this issue or other issues on Compass, please go to our website, pioneer.org, where we have a number of things, including some video of a recent community meeting in Appleton. Thanks for watching.